Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on the future of quality education and care, implementing the NQF review updates. So my name's Abby Weldon-Chan, and I'm the Senior Manager of the Policy Team at ASEQA. Today I also have here with me Kerry Lever. She's the Chief Executive of the Education Standards Board, and we're going to build on your knowledge of the recent changes to the National Quality Framework, or NQF, and extend your skills and understanding of how to apply this knowledge in your service in practice. Now, before we talk about the changes today, I thought it would be lovely to hear from Kerry and start with an acknowledgement of country. So over to you, Kerry.
Thank you, Abby, and it's lovely to be here with you all today. The Education Standards Board acknowledges that we are meeting on the traditional country of the Ghana people of the Adelaide Plains, and we pay our respect to elders past and present. We recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land. We acknowledge that they are of continuing importance to the Ghana people living today. And we also extend that respect to other Aboriginal language groups and other First Nations. If we could take a moment to pause, we'd like to play a very special acknowledgement to country and courtesy of the Department of Education in South Australia.
Thank you so much, Kerry. And I'd also like to extend an acknowledgement to the Gadigal peoples of the Eora Nation, the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which ASEQA is located in Sydney. And whilst this is a short webinar today, I'd like to acknowledge that this year is a significant time for all education and care services as you continue with your quality practice and support through these updates. Thank you for continually providing the space, comfort and guidance to support best outcomes for children in their formative years across South Australia. Now, today we'll hear from Kerry as she addresses the topics and questions that matter most to you around the NQF updates this year. We unfortunately won't have the time to go through every update to the NQF. However, we've selected the ones we think are the most impactful to children's health, safety and wellbeing. The ESB will be releasing a resource with the recording of today's session, which will outline the other updates that we haven't been able to cover today, along with any frequently asked questions from our pre-webinar survey. Along with this, we've placed a QR code at the end of the webinar to the NQF Changes Overview page on the ASEQA website, which will link you to further resources developed for each of the changes. Now, I do want to let you know that microphone, video and chat capabilities have been disabled for today's webinar to provide the time to discuss these updates. Now, if you have any questions after today, we encourage you to contact the South Australian ESB with any further questions that you might have. So, the implementation of the updates has been staged and staggered over March, July and October this year. So along with these updates, we'll provide you with some short examples to most of the updates to support your implementation. And we do want you to note that these are updates, these updates are from the examples of them only. You'll need to reflect and work with your service stakeholders to implement the updates in the best way, having regard for your own context. We'll also chat about updates to the national approved learning frameworks and the timeframes for these at the end of the session. So you should now be able to see some icons on the screen. These will be linked throughout today's webinar, and they will help you to guide your understanding of who will be impacted by each of the updates, whether it's centre-based care, family day care, school-aged children, or a mixture. You'll notice the webinar has been structured to group together changes for a mix of service types and then specific service types over each of the periods for which the changes were introduced. You'll hear about changes that directly relate to your service type and some that may not relate to you if you offer a different service type. Please bear with us until the end, though, to ensure you hear about all the changes that relate to you. Now, before we hear about the updates themselves, I wonder, Kerry, could you tell us a little bit about the NQF review itself?
Sure, Abby, I think that's a great starting point. Well, as many of you already know, the NQF provides a national approach to regulation, assessment and quality improvement for education and care services across Australia. A crucial and ongoing national dialogue addressing the provision of quality children's education and care in Australia persists, with more than 1 million children currently attending services across the country. Following on from the last review in 2014, the 2019 NQF review is a check-in to understand which areas of the NQF can still be improved, including the national law and the national regulations. Early in the review, an issues paper was created, which was used as the basis for an Australia-wide consultation. This led to governments gaining feedback from a wide range of stakeholders across the sector, including you online today, on important and critical issues. Based on this feedback, government developed options for consideration for regulatory and non-regulatory changes. Proposed changes were considered by education ministers across Australia, with final recommendations made in a decision regulation impact statement. Step by step, these changes have now been put in place to support the decisions of the 2019 NQF review and ensure that the NQF remains current, effective and fit for purpose in supporting children's health, safety and well-being into the future.
Thanks for that, Kerry. Should we get started on the changes that came in from the 1st of March?
Thank you. Yes, changes were introduced as of the 1st of March for providers that offer or arrange regular transportation of children as part of a centre-based service. There have been several changes around transportation. To help you understand the notion of regular transportation, there is a definition on the screen. There have been some updates to the responsibilities for approved providers and nominated supervisors and staff members around regular transportation. These include that a nominated supervisor or a staff member other than the driver must be present when children embark and disembark a vehicle at the service premises, account for each child when they embark and disembark a vehicle at the service premises, and complete an examination of the interior of the vehicle after all children have disembarked to ensure no children are left on the vehicle. There have also been updates to the record keeping and accounting for children during regular transportation. These records must include the information on the screen, and they must be made immediately available after the children have embarked and disembarked, and include the time, date, full name and signature of the person responsible for accounting for the children during the embarking and disembarking, and conducting the vehicle check after the children have disembarked. The records must be kept until the end of 3 years after the last date on which the child was educated and cared for by the service. If all requirements are met, these records may be kept in one document. And just to note again that these requirements only do apply to centre-based services. However, family daycare services should consider implementing these as best practice measures.
Thank you, Kerry. And just to add, ASIQA has recently developed a resource that might support services in implementing the record keeping for this change. It's called the Safe Transportation of Children Safety Checklist and Regular Transportation Record Form. It's linked in the NQF Review Changes Overview table, which we'll direct you to later on.
Thanks, Abby. That's great. It will definitely help to build the capacity of services in applying this change.
Yeah, I think so too, Kerry. Now, I've heard there are also updates and changes to mandatory notifications. Could you tell us a little bit about these, please?
Yes, thanks, Abby. These changes explain that it's now mandatory to notify the ESB in the first instance and at the final time your centre-based service provides or arranges regular transportation. This will need to happen within 7 days if the centre-based service starts or stops providing or arranging regular transportation. For those services who are already providing regular transport, if you haven't already notified us, you need to do that as soon as possible, please. It will also need to happen when applying for service approval for a centre-based service. A description of any proposed regular transport by or arranged by the service will need to be included. The approved provider needs to ensure this is lodged as a notification through the NQF using SA01, SA12 forms, or the quick edit function in your service form, dependent on the change.
Thank you, Kerry. And there are updates to policies and procedures for regular transportation as well?
Well, as you know, approved providers need to comply with the new requirements discussed relating to regular transportation. It is also important to mention that they are already required to take reasonable steps to ensure policies and procedures are followed. Therefore, services are encouraged to review and update their transport policies and procedures to ensure that these new requirements are addressed and the services procedures comply. A new compliance direction has also been introduced if an approved provider fails to conduct a transport risk assessment before seeking authorisation from a parent or another authorised nominee to transport the child. This emphasises the importance of ensuring the safety and well-being of children, as well as the heightened risk involved in transporting children to and from the service.
Thank you very much, Kerry. And I'm going to share an example to support this. So a long day care service recently received feedback from families and will, from November 2023, start picking up and dropping off children with their own minibus. The provider and nominated supervisor have decided to introduce rotating educators as the bus safety officers, and their role will include being present on the bus and accounting for children as they arrive or leave the service via the minibus, completing a documented roll call and the safe transportation of children safety checklist and regular transportation record I mentioned earlier that's on the ASEQA website, and checking the interior of the bus to ensure that there are no children left behind. So additionally, the service will inform the ESB within 7 days of this practice starting via the NQA-ITS, make a note to inform the ESB if this practice ceases, and review their policies and procedures on transportation of children to ensure they align with the new requirements. So I hope this example helps, Kerry, and thank you very much for touching on the changes from the 1st of March. Now, could you talk to us about the changes from the 1st of July?
Yes. Let's start with the short-term relief for early childhood educators. Did you know approved providers now have more flexibility to meet ratio and qualification requirements when a Certificate 3 or diploma level educator is absent for a short period of time in a centre-based service with children preschool age or under?
Okay, so could you explain those updates, Kerry, when replacing educators with Certificate 3 or diploma level qualifications in those short-term absences, please?
An educator who holds or is actively working towards an approved Certificate 3 or diploma level qualification can be replaced by a person who holds a qualification in primary teaching when the educator is absent due to the reasons displayed on the slide now. In these circumstances, an educator may be replaced for up to 30 days in a 12-month period while still satisfying the qualification requirements. If the educator being replaced works part-time, then they can be replaced for up to 30 days on a pro rata basis. So if they work in a job share role with one or more educators, the 30 days applies to the total number of days of absence for all the educators who contribute to that full-time role.
Thank you, Kerry. So what are the changes when replacing early childhood teachers for short-term absences?
Flexibility to cover short-term absences of an ECT, second ECT or suitably qualified person have also been expanded to include absences due to professional experience placements on top of the already implemented reasons. This enables their role to be replaced by a person who holds an approved diploma level qualification or a qualification in primary teaching. An ECT or a suitably qualified person can be replaced for up to 60 days in a 12-month period. These changes will not apply if the service employs or engages ECTs or suitably qualified persons on a full-time or full-time equivalent basis.
Thank you, Kerry. Are there any changes to record-keeping requirements for this?
Yes, approved providers are required to keep records when educators and ECTs or the suitably qualified persons are being replaced in the circumstances just described. The record will need to include the information that's now on the screen. This will help approved providers to keep track of the number of days for which each role is replaced to remain within the maximum time period.
Thank you, Kerry. They're great updates to support flexibility for staffing. So I'm going to share an example of a Certificate 3 educator who's being replaced. So Timo's a full-time Certificate 3 level educator and has taken a leave of absence due to illness on the 8th of August 2023. His role's been covered by Erica, who's a primary school teacher and who holds a qualification in primary teaching during that period of absence. Now, to determine whether the arrangement meets requirements, the service would need to look back 12 months to the 9th of August 2022 and calculate the total number of days that Timo's role had been replaced by the primary school teacher in that period. Now, if the combined total between the 9th of August 2022 and the 8th of August 2023 exceeds the 30 days, then the service will not comply. And I hope that example's put the update into perspective. And still in qualifications, moving on though, Kerry, could you tell us a little bit about how the understanding of how to show evidence of a person actively working towards a qualification?
Thank you, Abby. Yes, the current actively working towards provisions allow flexibility in staffing arrangements to mitigate the effects of current workplace shortages. As a result of the review, guidance, including an information sheet titled Educators who are actively working towards a qualification on the ASIQA website, where the table on the screen can now be found, has been produced to assist approved providers to understand how to gather evidence that staff are actively working towards qualifications and making suitable progress. Staff records should include evidence of any relevant qualification held by staff members or evidence of staff members who are actively working towards a qualification, such as a transcript or letter from the course provider. Approved providers may discuss this with the relevant regulatory authority. When checking whether requirements are being met, authorised officers may ask to see the following documentation: record of the educators working directly with children for centre-based services, or the record of staff, family daycare coordinators and family daycare educator assistants for family daycare services. On the screen now, you'll be able to see the evidence which can be collected to show an educator is making satisfactory progress towards a qualification. The provider should, however, regularly review and request updated evidence from the educator, depending on the circumstances. For example, annually or perhaps at the end of each study period.
And I'll just add here, Kerry, so a person could potentially still be considered actively working towards if they defer their studies, as long as they're meeting the requirements listed in the table. So the educator must be able to provide documentary evidence from the course provider. So, for example, a formal letter stating they're making satisfactory progress towards completing the course and maintaining the requirements for meeting requirements for maintaining enrolment. Course providers often have formal policies for granting deferrals, including the grounds for deferral. So, for example, personal or exceptional circumstances and the time frames for those deferrals. So, for example, typically not longer than 12 months. So focusing back on the initial change here, I'm wondering if you have an example, Kerry, to explore the update here.
Yes, let's talk about Asha. Asha is employed as an early childhood educator with an approved Certificate 3 in a long day care service. They have just enrolled into their diploma and given a copy of their enrolment to their nominated supervisor. ASHA is not yet considered to be working towards their diploma because the course has not yet commenced, so they can't provide documentary evidence that they're making progress towards completion. 3 months later, ASHA is progressing through their studies. They have now provided an updated transcript of their studies, showing they have completed 2 units of the diploma, and a letter from the training provider explaining that they are attending evening classes, meeting the requirements to maintain their enrolment.
Thanks very much, Kerry, for that example. What's the next change to talk through today?
Services that educate and care for children over preschool age now have more flexibility and capacity to develop quality-based programs for all children in their care, regardless of their enrolment and attendance patterns, with the removal of individualised documentation for children over preschool age. Services should understand each child and their strengths, ideas, abilities and interests, and their progress across the learning outcomes as part of the planning cycle. But this can now be reflected in documenting how and why the educational programme has been developed to support all children to participate in the programme. There is no prescribed method in the national law or regulations for documenting the educational programme, assessments or evaluations. There are many different electronic, visual and paper-based ways to do this, and a service can explore a range of styles and methods to determine what works best for their children, families and educators. However, it is in preparing the documentation, it is important to consider the information detailed on the screen. And I would encourage you all to engage in critical reflection on the practice of assessment and evaluation for wellbeing, learning and development, detailed in the My Time Our Place version 2.0.
Thank you, Kerry. I'm sure that will support a lot of services who educate and care for children over preschool age. However, I know there are some participants today who are wondering how to implement this while still considering individual children as part of Quality Area 1 of the National Quality Standard. So I'm going to give you an example to support that. So you arrive at an outside school hours care service with some areas set up with experiences and projects. Now, after afternoon tea, you notice conversations happening and children exercising their agency to choose resources that support their interests and ideas. The children are recording their ideas to play and activities on post-it notes and adding them to an inspiration wall. The children and educators then work together to design the activities recorded on the inspiration wall and to engage in those experiences together. As the children engage, the educators observe and document meaningful interactions and discussions between individuals and groups of children. The educators document the learning with connections to My Time, Our Place, and children record their thinking and reflections in their own reflection books, demonstrating their involvement in the evaluation process. At the end of the week, the educators discuss the observations, including discussions on their ongoing projects, experiences and children, and engage in curriculum decision-making for the next programme. Now, next up is a change that's given rise to a lot of questions, and particularly for providers who operate with a management committee, and that's around the definition of a person with management or control of a service. Now, these people must be and must remain fit and proper people to be involved with children's education and care. And this is important because PMCs make decisions on matters which can impact the safety, health and well-being of children at their service. So can you give us a little bit more detail about the context of these changes, Kerry?
Definition of a person with management or control, or PMC, has been expanded to ensure that the ESB can assess the suitability of all persons who have influence, control or authority over the delivery of the approved provider's services. The changes also improve the alignment of the definition of a PMC in the national law with that in the family assistance law. The approved provider is the legal entity that is approved to operate a service and is legally responsible for managing the service. However, PMCs are the persons within or outside of the approved provider who either participate in executive or financial decision-making or have authority, responsibility for, or significant influence over the planning, direction, or control of the activities or delivery of the service. It is important to note here that the approved provider must notify the regulatory authority of any appointment or removal of a PMC within 14 days of the event or within 14 days of becoming aware of it. A nominated supervisor, person in day-to-day charge of a service, or a person who holds other operational management roles in a service, such as a centre manager, would not meet the PMC definition simply by holding these roles in the service.
Thank you, Kerry. So I'll just give an example of one kind of person who might fall under the role of PMC. So this is around a large provider of an outside school hours care set of services who's recently employed an area manager, Kelly. Now, Kelly's role will be to visit the services to support their implementation of the NQF and to make informed decisions on service delivery and activities. So, for example, to support some new enrolments of children with additional learning needs, Kelly will work with one of the services to implement some changes to their physical environment, routines, and some transitions. Now, as Kelly has significant influence over the activities or delivery of the service, Kelly is considered a person with management or control, or PMC. The approved provider has assessed and notified the regulatory authority of Kelly's employment as a PMC using the PA08 notification of change to information about the approved provider form through the NQA ITS. Kelly's also completed a PA02, which is the Declaration of Fitness and Propriety form, and has a PRODA ID number. Now, I know this is only one example, and many other people would also be considered PMCs. However, this example does give us a little bit of perspective, and there will be additional information in the resources provided after the webinar. So now we're moving on to the changes to the family daycare coordinator to educator ratios. Kerry, could you please give us a little bit more information about this?
Yes, of course. The law has been amended to clarify the calculation of family daycare coordinators to educator ratios. For services that have been operating for less than 12 months, a minimum of one full-time equivalent FDC coordinator is required for every 15 FDC educators, or part thereof. And for services operating for more than 12 months, a minimum of one full-time equivalent FDC coordinator is required for a maximum of 25 FDC educators. There is a pro rata allowance for the second and subsequent coordinators. When a service operates for at least 12 months and engages more than 25 educators, the number of full-time coordinators must be engaged for every additional 5 educators, increases by 0.2 FTE. The regulatory authority may impose a higher ratio of, for example, 1 to 15 at any time after the first 12 months of operation of the FDC service.
Thank you, Kerry. So there are a couple of different ratio implications here, and hopefully this example provides a bit more context. So for a family daycare service, this one, for example, has been in operation for 4 years. They currently have 32 educators registered with them and are about to register another 4 educators. The family daycare service currently has one working full-time coordinator and another who's employed part-time who works 2 days per week. When the additional 4 educators begin, the part-time coordinator will be increasing their working hours to 3 days per week to meet the ratio requirements.
Thank you, Abby. Now's a good time to discuss the other October 1 changes. There have been some questions about the safe arrival of children changes, so let's dive into these. You see many children travel to and from an education and care service and an education or early childhood service. This is especially common between school and OSH services. The period of travel from one service to another educational setting or vice versa is a time of particular risk for children. To minimise the risk for children who travel between a service and any other education and early childhood services must have safe arrival of children policies and procedures in place and conduct a risk assessment for the purposes of preparing these policies and procedures. You'll see examples on the screen now of potential transitions that need to be considered here. The risk assessment needs to be conducted at least once every 12 months and as soon as practicable after becoming aware of any circumstances that may affect the safe arrival of children travelling between a service and any other education or early childhood service. The provider must keep a record of each risk assessment conducted relating to the safe arrival of children. Some of the factors that must be considered as part of a risk assessment are listed under Regulation 102 AAC. It's also important to note when informing your policies, procedures and risk assessments, you should consider multiple types of risk, which are seen on the screen now. These should be considered in consultation with your own stakeholders and taking into account your unique service context. We've also had some questions about the need for policies and procedures regarding safe arrival of children, regardless of whether travel is conducted or not. As this is now a policy which is located in Regulation 168, there is a requirement to have these policies and procedures in place. This is to support the safeguarding of children's health, safety and well-being at any stage in the event that this service may be needed.
Thank you, Kerry. And now we know the changes. I'm going to just clarify this with an example of what it might look like in practice. So a group of 17 school-aged children are moved to the nearby school with 2 educators, one being the responsible person on duty. In a recent staff meeting, the service completed a risk assessment to identify any risks related to this practice. And this included the need to walk over a small bridge over stagnant water. The educators analysed this and put in place strategies to reduce the risks associated with the bridge and with the water. This was then added into the service's policies and procedures for the safe arrival of children and the service's induction manual, as the approved provider must take reasonable steps to ensure that nominated supervisors and staff members of and volunteers at the service follow the policies and procedures. The service diarised a 12-month review and identified potential triggers which might require an earlier review of the risk assessment. And I hope this example helps to illustrate the changes. Now, moving on, we've had quite a number of questions regarding the recent sleep and rest changes. I was hoping you might be able to share some information on these changes to support our audience today, Kerry.
Yes, before I do, I did just want to let everyone know that there has been a marked reduction in sudden unexpected death in infants, SUDI, across Australia in recent decades. However, young children remain at risk of SUDI during periods of sleep and rest, including in education and care services. While there continues to be SUDI deaths in Australia each year, there is also a lack of awareness and knowledge about safe sleeping, hence the changes. If I could also mention how great it is that our sector is so interested in hearing about these changes. We've had a lot of questions on this in the lead up to the seminar. Your commitment to children's safety is commendable.
Absolutely, Kerry. And before we discuss the changes, I think it's important that we speak about the regulatory impact. It is important to notice here that approved providers, nominated supervisors and family daycare educators must already take reasonable steps to ensure that the needs for sleep and rest of children being educated and cared for by the service are met, having particular regard to the ages, the developmental stages and the individual needs of children.
Yes, Abby, thank you for bringing that up. So in regard to the 2 changes that have been made, these include the first one being that while services are already required to have policies and procedures in place relating to sleep and rest, the national regulations have now set out additional matters that must be included in these policies and procedures. And secondly, the changes that approved providers are required to conduct a risk assessment at least once every 12 months and as soon as practicable after becoming aware of any circumstance that may affect the health, safety or well-being of children during sleep or rest. The approved provider must keep a copy of each risk assessment conducted and make any necessary updates to sleep and rest policies and procedures. The risk assessment must include, but is not limited to, points found under Regulation 84C.
Thank you, Kerry. So now we know the changes. I'm just going to run through a quick example of what that might look like in practice. So Alex has been a family daycare educator for 5 years, and they've just had one of the children transition to walking and is starting to attempt to climb out of their cot. Now, as this has just created a new safety concern for the child, Alex works with their coordinator to reassess the sleep and rest environment to provide the child with a bed rather than a cot. Together, they analyse the space to inform the new risk assessment. Alex then ensures this is communicated to the families and has a copy of the risk assessment on site. The coordinator also details this information, and they decide to reassess in a month once the child has transitioned successfully. And together they review the policy and procedure to ensure the changes and the risk assessment findings inform the policies and procedures.
Thank you, Abby. While we are aware that bassinets are not commonly used in the South Australian context anymore, we wanted to inform you that bassinets have now been prohibited from education and care service premises.
Thank you, Kerry. So now we're going to move on to talk about how the child safe principles have been aligned to the National Quality Framework.
Yes, during the NQF review, it was identified that while the NQF generally aligns with the child safe principles, there are some areas that it could be strengthened to improve that alignment. Volunteers and students must now be advised of the existence and application of the current child protection law and any obligations they may have under that law. Working with children check numbers and expiry dates must now be included on their staff records, except where a volunteer or student has a teacher registration number. In this case, their teacher registration number and expiry date can be recorded in the staff record instead of the Working with Children check. Just a reminder that responding to abuse and neglect, or RAN training, is mandatory for all teachers and all staff working in the Department for Education, Catholic Education South Australia, and the Association of Independent Schools of South Australia. There are also some changes required for policies and procedures. The policies and procedures which services have relating to providing a child-safe environment must now include the promotion of a child-safe culture and the safe use of online environments. Complaint handling policies and procedures must also be child-focused and include managing complaints alleging a child is exhibiting harmful sexual behaviours.
Thank you, Kerry. And now that we understand the changes a bit more, I would like to give you an example about Harriet. Now, Harriet's an early childhood educator working in a long day care service. They recently finished their diploma in early childhood education and care, completing their work placement at a preschool down the road. Now, Harriet had been working in the long day care service for 5 years. James, the nominated supervisor of the preschool, asked Harriet for their Working with Children check number. Harriet thought because they were working in the long daycare service that would satisfy any concerns. But James insisted on obtaining that Working with Children check, along with their date of birth and expiry date of the Working with Children check. James didn't allow Harriet to start at the preschool until the Working with Children check information had been cleared through the DHS screening unit. And once it was, Harriet started their placement. Now, I hope Harriet's example has clarified the requirements a little more. Now, another introduction to support children and family safety concerns are around release of information to parents. Can you tell us about this introduction, Kerry?
Yes, as we know, parents can request any information about their child, assuming there are no court orders preventing this from occurring. However, there has been an introduction to ensure written permission is sought before disclosing personal information to a parent of a child relating to the following people on the screen. It's important to note here that a person giving written permission is able to withdraw their consent in writing at any time before the information is disclosed. You should consider whether there is another person's personal information contained within the information that relates to the child.
Thank you, Kerry. So we're just going to talk about one of the people on the screen at the moment, and in relation to a child at a service called Oliver. Now, Oliver's mothers, Jess and Layla, are currently separating, and Layla has moved to a new home. Jess and Layla have made a personal agreement for Oliver to stay with Layla every second week. And the separation seems quite amicable, both still engaged with the service. Now, one day, Jess comes into the service and requests to see Oliver's enrolment form. Now, the nominated supervisor contacts Layla to obtain her permission to provide this information because it has Layla's new address in it. This consent needs to be provided in writing, or the information will need to be provided without Layla's personal information contained. And I just want to note here that while this is one specific example, and it does only consider one type of persons we mentioned on the screen, it would be very beneficial for everyone to look through the list of people to identify how this would be considered and applied in your service. So, Kerry, I know that many first aid qualifications have currency periods. What's changed in relation to these?
Well, the currency period for first aid qualifications, anaphylaxis management training and emergency asthma management training is 3 years. This is a defined period set under the National Poly Framework and not solely from a registered training provider's perspective. And the currency period for CPR training, which can be delivered separately or as part of a first aid qualification, is 1 year.
Thank you very much for that clarification, Kerry. So the next few changes are specific to family daycare. Could you tell us a little bit about the first of these?
Yes. So as we all know, young children are curious and attracted to water. Active supervision is therefore vital to prevent drowning among young children and requires adults to be within arm's reach of a child in, on or around water. While it is rare for a drowning death to occur, it is a catastrophic consequence, usually the result of a lapse of supervision during which a child can breach safety barriers. Because of this, FDC residences with swimming pools can continue to operate with additional safeguards to ensure active supervision and regular review of risks. Providers are required to conduct a monthly inspection of any swimming pool, water feature, or other potential water hazards at an FDC residence or venue. An inspection needs to identify and assess any risks to the health, safety, and well-being of children. Factors to consider include adequate fencing and maintaining a safe environment to minimise the chance of children accessing any water. The provider can nominate a person to conduct the inspection, provided the nominee is not a resident or an educator or educator assistant working at the residence or venue. A written inspection report is required to be completed based on the inspection, identifying and assessing any risks.
Thank you very much, Kerry. So I'm going to provide an example of this in practice. So this is about a small family daycare service that has 3 educators who own pools in their backyards. The approved provider has nominated the coordinators to do the monthly checks. In October, Helen, the coordinator, went over to Justine's house for a monthly inspection of the pool. As they were completing the written inspection report whilst inspecting the environment, they noticed the latch of the pool gate was becoming loose. Helen noted this on the report, including an action to change the latch. There was also a discussion of how to minimise the risk in the immediate time frame, to which both Helen and Justine decided that creating a barrier a few metres away from the pool gate for children would mean they don't have access to the gate at all. Helen then provided the report to the approved provider within 24 hours, and the approved provider then ensured the report was filed appropriately and a copy given to Justine. And the pool gate was fixed the next day. So I hope that helps understand changes around water hazards. Kerry, there have been some changes around safety glass too, I understand?
Yes, to address the inconsistency across the sector and to protect children, all FDC residences and venues now need to comply with the 0.75 metre height requirement for safety glass. This includes any glazed area within a family daycare residence or approved venue accessible to children. It includes areas that are used by children to access the approved space, such as the front door.
Thank you, Kerry. You can really see a theme here of improving safeguarding of children's health, safety and well-being. And would you mind telling us about the record-keeping changes for family daycare?
Definitely. Family daycare educators are limited to educating and caring for a maximum of 7 children. However, in exceptional circumstances, FDC educators can educate and care for more than 7 children or more than 4 children who are preschool age or under at any one time, where they are granted written approval by the provider. More details on this can be found in Regulation 124. To enable regulatory authorities to have greater oversight of services operating with a higher number of children, providers must include details of FDC educators operating with more than 7 children or more than 4 children preschool age or under due to exceptional circumstances on the FDC register. Details are included on the screen now. These details must be recorded each time the provider approves an FDC educator to educate and care for more than 7 children or for more than 4 children who are preschool age or under.
Thank you very much, Kerry. So the following change also supports the overall health, safety and well-being of children attending family daycare, and it addresses circumstances in which a resident is no longer suitable to be around children. Could you tell us a bit about this, Kerry?
Yes, family daycare educators must notify the approved provider of any circumstances relating to whether a person who resides or intends to reside at an FDC residence is a fit and proper person to be in the company of children. This includes the points on the screen. I'll give you a moment to read those. Also, the family daycare educator must notify the provider of any circumstances arising at an FDC residence or approved FDC venue that may pose a risk to health, safety and well-being of children cared for at the residence or the venue, including those on screen now. Renovations or other changes to the residence or venue, an infectious disease outbreak, a bush, flood or other natural disaster that may affect the residence or venue.
Thank you very much for that information, Kerry. Now, setting the 2019 NQF review aside, let's discuss another change that's been communicated in 2023.
Well, under the national law and regulations, services are required to base their programme on an approved learning framework, or ALF. Following a process to refresh the national ALFs, updated versions were released early in 2023. There are 2 national approved learning frameworks which outline practices that support and promote children's learning. Belonging, Being and Becoming, the Early Years Learning Framework for Australia, EYLF, and My Time, Our Place Framework for School Age Care in Australia, MTOP. The changes you will find in both framework documents comprise a mix of clarifications and expanded explanations across the principles, practices and learning outcomes of the original ALFs, and a smaller number of more substantial changes. In particular, you will see a stronger connection between the frameworks and the National Quality Standard in the areas you can see on the screen now. The original national ALFs remain in operation alongside the updated frameworks until February 2024. This is to enable providers and their services time to transition to the updated frameworks. You will see a QR code on the screen now, which will take you to further resources and information on the updated ALFs.
Thank you, Kerry. That is a lot of information and changes to implement. I do hope this is helpful, and there's just a couple of slides left. And also a recent update to the guide to the National Quality Framework, which includes all of this information and the National Approved Learning Frameworks as well. So now that everyone has this information, the question is where to next? And Kerry, some of our participants have asked, how can we support our educators and families through the change? And I'm wondering if you could give us some helpful tips on this.
Great question, Abby. I can appreciate it may seem overwhelming. It is great to see such supportive people wanting to ensure that these changes are seamlessly implemented as possible go. And I would say, as you have already started implementing the changes, your next phase may be to start reflecting on how the changes are going for your service, families, team, and questioning, most importantly, are the ways in which we're implementing these changes achieving the best outcomes for children. It is important to involve all your stakeholders, just as you would with any other change in the service. The number of changes may seem challenging to put in place. However, it's important to keep coming back to the why, and that is to support best outcomes for children. Take it one day at a time and ensure all stakeholders are involved in the process of change. So here are some helpful next steps you might like to consider. Align the changes against your service's philosophy. Read the supportive documents that are linked on the NQF changes overview page, which we will shortly be linking you to. We also encourage you to look through the guide to the National Quality Framework. This has been updated to support the changes. Section 4 has information about your operational requirements. Review your policies and procedures to align with changes and consider the implementation of these. Again, take it one policy at a time. Identify practices and documents that need to change or be created, and look at identifying who will be involved in this process. Discuss the changes with all your stakeholders to take on different perspectives, including First Nations perspectives. What ongoing learning and support is needed for the team? Does this include professional development, mentorship, or engagement in some way? Engage in further critical reflection with your team. And lastly, consider where you may document your journey on these changes. What would your journey to continuous improvement look like? Could your quality improvement plan be a helpful document to engage with, perhaps?
Thank you. That last point you've mentioned is a really timely one here, Kerry, as in a couple of weeks we'll be having a second webinar. And in case participants haven't heard, ASIQA and the ESB will be co-hosting the second webinar on the journey of continuous improvement. Please take a look on the ESB website, and if you haven't already, please register. While this second webinar won't go into the changes, it will speak on a process of continuous improvement, which you may like to adapt to support your service through the changes we've talked about today in regard to the National Quality Framework. I also wanted to let everyone know that there are also some food safety changes, which quite a few of our participants have asked about today. Now, these are due to come into place in December. And while they're not based on the National Quality Framework changes themselves, we do impact that this also affects education and care services. As this isn't our area of expertise, the ESB will add a link to the relevant authorities in the resources, which will become available for everyone after the recording. Thank you so much for sharing all this information today, Kerry. Was there anything else you wanted to mention before we finish up?
Thank you, Abby. I just wanted to thank everybody for engaging with us and getting through these updates with us today. This seminar is the first in a series to provide education and guidance to the South Australian early childhood sector, and it's in line with our shift in regulatory posture or approach to increase the ESB's engagement, collaboration and support. To continue to navigate the changes, you can go to the NQF changes overview page of the ASIQA website. We've placed a QR code on the screen for you to do this. Remember to also keep an eye out on our bulletins and website. We will publish a recording of this webinar, along with some additional resources to support the changes. I hope everyone has a great afternoon, and we look forward to supporting you along your journey.
Thank you, Kerry, for all your insights today. And thank you, everyone, for attending this webinar. We hope you have a lovely rest of your day. And please remember, if you do have any follow-up questions, you're welcome to reach out to the ESB for more information. Thanks very much, everyone.